Welcome back, everyone, to the afternoon session of Powerful Migrations. As I said before, unfortunately, our first speaker, Avinoam Shalem from Colombia, has fallen ill. He sends his greetings, but he can't come. And he did send, however, a script and a PowerPoint, and our afternoon's moderator, Fariba Zarinebaf, kindly agreed to read parts of it. It's a longer paper. She will read the first major part and then the conclusion. And I'm afraid it doesn't make much sense to have a Q&A, but I would like to encourage you to get in touch with Avinoam at Columbia if you have any questions or if you want to read the entire paper. So without further ado, I'm handing over to Fariba. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeanette. And I wanted to thank Vice Provost Kalu and Jeanette Cole for organizing this wonderful conference. I missed the first half because I had to teach. But I hope that we will continue discussing these very important issues, sometimes very politicized and indeed very relevant, especially on a campus of the UC that is one of the most diverse campuses, and of course the most diverse campus of the UC. And we are dealing with these issues in our classrooms all the time, so I'm really glad to see some students here. I invited mine to join us because I had to cancel my class this afternoon. So unfortunately, Professor Shalem couldn't be here. I'm just going to give you a brief biography and then read parts of his paper. I'm not going to do justice to the content of the paper because I just received it, but I think it's really important to include it and at least read parts of it, and perhaps you can contact him and get the whole paper. We don't have the permission from him to distribute the paper, so I really encourage you to get in touch with him, and he will be very happy that you at least heard part of the paper and are interested in seeing the whole thing. Can you hear? Okay, so Professor Shalem is the Reggio Professor of Art History, teaches the arts of Islam at Columbia University. He co-authored the exhibition entitled The Future of Tradition, The Tradition of Future, which was published in 2010, and directs the projects When Nature Becomes Ideology, Palestine After 1947. He recently co-edited The Image of the Prophet Between Ideal and Ideology, a scholarly investigation, which was published in 2014, and another book project entitled Gazing Otherwise, Modalities of Seeing in and Beyond the Lands of Islam, which was published by Brill in 2015. So the paper that he wanted to present today is entitled The Commoditization of Nature, Palestinian Landscape Zionized. Erin Kerem, or Ein Kerim in Arabic, namely the Kerim's Spring, located in Jerusalem district, was depopulated in July 1948. According to Walid Khalidi's seminal work entitled All That Remains, the Palestinian village occupied and depopulated by Israel in 1948, which he published in English in 1992, the village in 1945 consisted of about 3,000 inhabitants, 2,500 of which were Palestinian Muslims and 1,670 Palestinian Christians. Walid Khalidi described this village, I quote, or he quotes, Ein Kerim was one of the few villages to survive its depopulation with its buildings intact. The others were Tabrika, Acre District, Ein Haut, Balad al-Sheikh, and Al-Tira, which was in the Haifa district, Al-Safiriya, which was in the Jaffa district, and Deir Yassin and El-Maliha, which was in Jerusalem district. Today, the village houses are inhabited by Jewish families. One Christian Arab family exiled from the village of Erith in the Acre district in 1949 lives in the village in an old school building attached to the Franciscan monastery. Some of the larger houses are beautiful limestone buildings 2 or 3 stories high with arched windows and doors recessed into a larger arch facade. Some doors open onto balconies with metal railings. There are 7 Christian churches and monasteries in the village. There is also a Christian cemetery beside the Russian monastery, a Muslim cemetery in the center of the village, covered with refuse and dirt, contains a prominent tomb with a large structure. The village mosque, in a state of disrepair, still stands with its minaret. The spring of Ain Maryam, or Maryam's spring, flows out of the mosque courtyard. Unquote. The fate of this village was part of, let me go to slide 3, was part of the Grand Zionist Project, which today, as some of the archives of the State of Israel have been released for public inspection, can be clearly defined as ethnic cleansing. According to PAP, a plan for the systematic expulsion of Palestinians, either in urban populated areas or in rural regions, was taken by the Zionist leader in the 10th of March in 1945. PAP adds, the order came with a detailed description of the methods to be employed to forcibly evict the people, large-scale intimidation, laying siege to and bombarding villages and population centers, setting fire to homes, properties, and goods, expulsions, demolitions, and finally planting mines among the rubble to prevent any of the expelled inhabitants from returning. The plan, called Plan D, was set forth by the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary organization which was established in 1921 during the British Mandate Rule, and later after 1948, formed the core of the IDF, or the Israeli Defense Force. The mission was completed in 6 months, and as a result, more than 50% of the Arab population, about 800,000 Palestinians, were evicted. 531 villages were destroyed, and 11 urban neighborhoods emptied of their native population. This new evidence brought by PAP in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, shattered the Zionist myth that expulsion began on May 15, 1948, just after the independent declaration of the Jewish state by Ben-Gurion, and during the War of 1948, as a result of the so-called defensive war that Israel was forced into after being attacked by the neighboring Arab countries. According to PAP, at least 250,000 Palestinians were expelled by force and terror before May 15, 1948. Expulsion was a plan. It started without a war and was implemented on a bigger scale during the war. Thus, the warfare situation was misused for the Zionist fight for a change in the demography of Palestine, Israel. The eviction of the Palestinians was systematically planned, and the destruction involved urban and rural spaces too. In this paper, he would like to focus on the rural areas. I'm using he because it's not me. This decision is made because the history of the expulsion of Palestinians from the major urban centers has been intensively studied. As part of the Zionist strategy to erase the Palestinian memory of Palestine, efforts were made to sack and loot any evidence of Palestinian culture stored in the main urban centers within the Israeli Green Line. This mainly involved the confiscation and looting of public and private libraries in the cities of Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, and to some extent Nazareth, and their categorization in such manner that enable restricted access. It is likely that the project of the Zionists to illustrate the modern pre-Zionist history of this land as a state devoid of culture, and any national identity was part of the general opinion of giving to people with no land, a land with no people. The intellectual life of Palestine, which, as in any other land, flourished in urban centers, was therefore a disturbing fact, and its factual evidence was therefore concealed and to some extent destroyed. The rural spaces of small villages and settlements appeared less troublesome. Here, the farmers, the falahin, were defined as primitive, backward, and even lazy and stupid, as this word also suggests in its present use. This meaning. And yet the rural space, or one may say the countryside, as I think an extremely interesting space because it forms, like in a picture, the background for any image. To be more precise, my point concerns two issues. First, the Zionist transformation of nature into landscape, namely, as the word etymologically means, the shaping of land, and I refer to the turning of nature into a man-made land. The second issue concerns the landscape as background. This notion takes for granted that landscape is already an image, and therefore takes the role of background as in a picture. The history of the discovery of landscape as image is highly interesting. As as Joachim Ritter suggested in 1963 in his article, Landschaft, it is a German title, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna, he translates it. It's about the function of aesthetic in the modern society. The particular process involving the transformation of nature into landscape in the modern era can be termed the object making of nature. This is an aesthetic process that embodies the modern human desire for freedom by means of creating a clear distinction, a detachment between nature and man by turning it into his or her object of gaze. I will follow, to some extent, Ritter is suggesting that the ideological-driven man-made nature of Israel turned its landscape into a background, an image that sets the specific tenor by which history of the space can and should be read. The rural appears then as the general atmosphere, like music played at the background of other voices at the foreground, which tells the narrative. This vein of interpreting the landscape of Palestine significantly differs from other approaches taken by scholars so far in discussing the memory of Palestine in the landscape of Israel today. These studies, like those of Ian Papp, entitled The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, especially in his chapter, the memory side of Nakba, or of Cadman in her book entitled Erased from Space and Consciousness, and other books, regard the remains of the Palestinian memories in the landscape of Israel similar to the function of relics, as remains of bodies in keeping memories of the past. Thus, according to these authors, the Palestinian tangible sites form only bits within the Israeli landscape and are located only on one margins of the roads and consciousness of the Israeli landscape and society. I would like to argue that the present Palestinian-Israeli landscape should be discussed as a whole, forming what I term background and staging for the particular picture by the Zionists aimed and still aim at exhibiting in order to narrate their ideological story of Palestine. My approach aims at avoiding the division between Zionist and Palestinian memories of this landscape and desires to read the whole picture as a landscape, as landshaping in which different iconographies work together to tell stories. It is against deconstructing or taking apart nature and landscape, but rather assembling them in order to analyze how varied parts work or do not work together or inflict, impose or erase each other. So I'm going to turn to his conclusion because the paper is really interesting, and I don't think I'm going to do justice reading the rest of it in a rush. But I would like to read his conclusion because I think it really kind of summarizes his approach, which is pretty interesting. So the use and misuse of nature and landscape in Palestine reveals that nature, commonly regarded as by us as innocent, was edited to narrate specific ideology. Thus, the innocent scenic view of the western slopes of Jerusalem that opens to the eyes of the visitor to Yad Vashem must be revisited. The whole experience in Yad Vashem, a grand Holocaust museums project by the architect Moshe Safdie, which combines memory and landscape into a monumental environmental sculpture, reminds the visitors of other building projects which aim at conquering nature. The colossal manner by which architecture interacts with nature in this complex recalls the dramatic vision of architecture interacting with nature at the big dam of Aswan in Egypt at the Yenikapı, the main station of the Marmara rail on the European shores of the Bosphorus. A huge building project that involved the building of the first tunnel that links Asia and Europe. At any case, the travel in time experienced by the visitors of Yad Vashem in front of the exhibited material and while walking through the elongated and central tunnel of the museum ends with the impressive hilly landscape of Jerusalem. The contrast between the feeling of imprisonment inside the underground museum space and the great feeling of freedom and hope, which fills the viewer's hearts at the end of this journey, while standing on the huge open balcony is deliberately choreographed by Safdie, the architect. And yet this landscape scenery reveals another history of trauma and pain. Covered by thousands of pine trees, these hills conceal the stone-built Palestinian terraces of former olive groves and vineyards. It would be appropriate to end this talk with the concluding paragraph taken from Martin Warnecke's groundbreaking book called Political Landscape, The Art History of Nature, published in 1995. I quote, "It is no longer possible to contrast an innocent landscape with an alienated humanity. The landscape can no longer be so naively delimited. The landscape is so saturated by the toxins of civilizations that it has been forced out of its former role and into a new one. It no longer compensates for civilization, but raises it to a higher power." Thank you. Okay. So, as I said, we are not going to have, or as Jeanette mentioned, we are not going to have a Q&A, but as you can see, this paper really is beautifully written. It's very emotional. When I was looking at it, I felt that I couldn't read the whole thing. And I really wish he would have been here and he would have put all his feelings into it and shown you the images. So we are really sorry that he was ill and he couldn't come, but I really encourage you to contact him and obtain a copy of the paper because we cannot really distribute this. So we are going to move on to our second speaker, right? Yes, of course. Oh, actually, how you met them? Maybe you want to...
No. I just, because I didn't get much more than an impression, but the way that he rethinks what happens after forced migration. What do these spaces actually become? How are they framed? And in this particular incident, they are aestheticized in a very odd manner. They create a backdrop for the staging of new ideologies. I guess that's what he had in mind, and which is a way I'd never really thought about these processes. We've entered the realm of space.
Right, exactly. And I really think it's really important to kind of look at also appropriation. And of course, in my opinion, all these people belong to that landscape. It's really important that, they all claim part of it. But also the history of it is really important. So when I was talking to actually Erith, and as a historian, I teach about the Holy Land. And we just had a seminar on mysticism and devotion in the Mediterranean, and trying to figure out why this region is such a contested region. And one of the points I always bring up to my students is, just think about, these three religions being born in this area, the Holy Land being located here, and why it's been so contested for centuries, not just the 20th century after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, but let's go back, to the Crusades or the rise of Islam. They are constantly fighting over this piece of land. Of course, the Jewish communities are too small, right, to make any claims, but it's mainly the Muslims and Christians, right? And so appropriation is constantly taking place. There are churches that are constantly being turned into mosques and vice versa. So I think the historical, landscape to me has so many layers, and we have added yet another layer. And it's just really interesting that in the 20th century, these layers cannot exist at the same time. It has to be one at the expense of the other. Whereas in the pre-modern period, people were more open. You could have a church next, like, the way he describes the first village, where you had in the past, a Muslim cemetery next to a Christian one, right? Churches next to mosques. And that's the history of this region, until the 20th century. So I don't know what to blame, but I blame a lot of it in nationalism as a historian, that, the whole thing becomes so violent. So anyway, so I work on questions of cosmopolitanism, diversity, cohabitation between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the pre-modern period, and it seems to me, without idealizing the past, that the past was a happier picture. So I'm just going to end that notes there, but I think Erith is going to take us back to the past, and maybe, we'll go back to the western part of the Mediterranean, kind of from the east to the west. So I want to introduce our second speaker, my dear colleague, Erith Jaffe-Berg, who's a professor and chair of the Department of Theater. Theater, film, and digital production. You have such a good, nice name. And she teaches here at the University of California at Riverside. She has had, a number of major publications, including one recent one called Commedia dell'arte and the Mediterranean, Charting Journeys and Mapping Others, which was published by Ashgate and Routledge, right, in 2015. And then her previous book called The Multilingual Art of Commedia dell'arte, which was published in 2009. She's currently contributing to two anthology projects from Bloomsbury, A Cultural History of Theater in the Middle Ages, and the second one is A Cultural History of Tragedy in the Middle Ages. She has contributed to numerous articles in different journals and publications, and she's the chair of her department and a wonderful collaborator. So I would like to invite Erith to present to us her paper. I think you're going to talk about your paper, not just read it, called Cross-Cultural Contacts in the Early Mediterranean Italian Theater.
Okay, so I too first want to thank Fariba for that lovely introduction. We're very lucky on this campus to have a number of different collaborative groups, and one of them is the Middle East and Islamic Studies group, and we're both a part of it. And although the history and the politics may be very fractious elsewhere, on campus at UCR, it manages to be remarkably peaceful. And I also want to thank Jeanette, of course. This is really a remarkable undertaking. Jeanette is also a chair at the same time, so hats off to you. As well, I want to thank our Vice Provost, Kaleki Kalu, for his imagining of this in the first place. Obviously, it's very timely, and I think it speaks to the timeliness that so many different disciplines have wanted to have a stake in speaking to the topic. And of course, the Center for Ideas in Society, the director, Georgia Warnke, who leads this Humanities Center on our campus, as well as Catherine Henshaw and Renee Daguerre, without whom it really couldn't happen. So thank you to all of these people. All right, let me try to conjure this up. Okay, and I will try to keep this to 30 minutes. We have a little more time today. Okay, so I'm gonna take a step into the terrain of the arts, my field, and theater history in particular. And I'm gonna try to introduce ideas that I think are inspired by a book and by a thinker. And I'm thinking of Maria Rosa Menocal in thinking back on a period of cohabitation amongst Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And she's in her book, The Ornament of the World, writing about the reality in the Iberian Peninsula before 1492. And I'm going to be writing about and thinking about the period post-1492. But her term of complex tolerance comes to mind. And I was also very taken this morning by Nina Schiller's comment that migrants are city makers or space makers. So with those two ideas in mind, I want to exercise the right to unfold three stories here today. And all three stories are set against a backdrop as well, and it's a paradoxical backdrop because it's the backdrop of the post-1492 exilic reality. It's a turbulent time across the world. We know 1492 is the age of discovery, marks the age of discovery, but it is, of course, the age of conquest and decimation as well. If we're thinking about the New World, if we're thinking about Latin America, Central America, North America, but also if we're thinking back on the so-called Old World, if we're thinking about Europe. 1492 is the period of the demarcation of the Edict of Expulsion from Spain, and that means that Jews and Muslims who had for centuries lived in relative peace and harmony are no longer welcome in that region. And 1492 then is superseded by 1497, where the expulsion is from Portugal as well. Many of the forced converts had resisted and then migrated to Portugal, but then they were forced to migrate out of Portugal. And so we have a mass migration, patterns of mass migration happening all over the world. One of the destination points is, of course, the Ottoman Empire, which is a welcoming haven at the time to Muslims as well as Jews. And another maybe unlikely, less often told story is another destination, and that is to Italy. And that is the area that I explore. So my first story then, our first story begins in Italy, in northern Italy, in a town that few of us probably have heard of, the town of Mantua, except it has a leading role in Romeo and Juliet because Romeo gets, actually is exiled there, you could say. So our first story begins in Mantua, and Mantua, just to locate us and give us a sense of it, is in the northern part of the Italian peninsula. Of course, when we're talking about the 16th century, we have to say Italian peninsula rather than Italy because Italy is not Italy at the time. It's not unified until the 19th century. So this is the region in green. It's landlocked, so it seems to be kind of hard to get to, and it is a little bit hard to get to. Even today, you have to take multiple trains, and it's a little bit of a hassle. But in other ways, it's an important thoroughfare because you could see that it leads you up through the Alps into the rest of Europe. It's also located conveniently both in the Adriatic, but also close to the Mediterranean. So if only water could connect you to all of those bodies, you could access things quite readily. And fortunately for Mantua, water does connect it because it has a system of canals, so much of a system of canals that it is often known as the Little Venice. And so here it is, couldn't resist another beautiful image of the Little Venice, La Piccola Venezia. And it's in the region of Lombardy. At the time, it's a region, Mantua is part of the Mantovano, so it's all ruled by a family that actually plays a leading role in the story I'm about to unfold. This is the Gonzaga dukes. You could imagine as the Italian peninsula is so fractious at this period of time, you have vying powers. Economic, military, political. Of course, you've got the papal states down south. And so strong families and strong, wealthy families assert themselves periodically, and the Gonzaga are one of these families. So here we are in Mantua, the Little Venezia. It's also, I should say that it's circling it are three large lakes. And so not only does it have a system of canals, but it also has bigger bodies of water around it. So it's very conducive to trade. It's very conducive to migrancy at this period. So it's not surprising that starting in the 13th century, actually beginning very, very in small ways in the 12th, but then really taking over in the 13th century, is migration patterns that begin for populations of Jews who at the time come and locate and are welcomed by the Gonzaga family because they can do what Catholics cannot. They can offer loans with interest, and that's important for this. This is a famous, of course, money lending profession that is allowed to Jews, one of the few professions that are allowed to Jews at the time. And that's important for this region because even though the Gonzaga are wealthy, the people around the region are not wealthy. It's largely an agrarian community. It's agricultural. It still is today. It's not far from the Po Valley, which is the fertile area in Italy responsible for so much agriculture. And of course, farmers are particularly prone to vicissitudes of fortune because one flood can decimate everything for you, right? And so depending on small loan possibilities is very important for the well-being of the economy of this area. And that's important for the Gonzaga because it preserves peacefulness, of course, and keeps everything under control. So you could see how one body politically and economically works with another at the time. And Jews are very convenient in that sense because they help the economy by offering small loans. This is not a wealthy community largely of Jews, but it's the smaller intermediary kind of communities. And so I think it's kind of symbolic that even the Jewish Association of Mantua, and there are very, very few Jews living in Mantua still today, but there are few, but the Jewish Association or the Association of Jewish Culture, which is largely an intercultural group, because there are so few Jews, refers to the town of Mantova, and it uses the Hebrew and it also uses the Italian, and it calls it Mantova. If you read Hebrew from the right to the left, then you start with the Hebrew man, and it's man as in manna, manna from heaven, right? And in Italian, manna buona, good manna, manna from heaven. And so there's a lovely play on the two languages there, and also the onomatopoeic potential of the language itself. It is considered a city of good fortune, good manna, manna from heaven, good nourishment, but also good protection. And I think it's very telling that one of the residents, the early residents in the 16th century, writes, when he's thinking about this town, he writes that we are living here under the happy shadow. And I think that the symbol, the emblem here, together with the notion of happy shadow, again is very revealing, because there is security in being protected, but of course you're still residing in the shadows. So I use that in a telling way. So my story involves theater making, because we could see that the economics are very make sense for different populations of migrants and immigrants in this particular place. But what does that have to do with art making, right? And what I've explored is the ways in which a very strange occurrence happens in Mantova, beginning in 1520. And in 1520, for the first time, and then 1525 again, we find evidence that there is something called a comedy. And one of the evidence pieces is here. Tomorrow, we find in the archives, tomorrow will be presented, there'll be another comedy presented in the house of the children of Sir Zoan that will be recited by the Jews based on their own composition, and as such, we will pass this small carnival. So that's interesting. This happens in 1520, then it happens again in 1525. Then as you're looking through the archival traces, it happens again and again. As a matter of fact, it happens almost every year until 1650. Very interesting. 1520 to 1650, almost 130, 150 years of continual making of theater. Very unusual. Another element here that might strike us is the fact that it's a comedy that's presented in the house of Sir Zoan. Who's Sir Zoan? It's not a particularly, if you're more familiar, it's not a particularly Jewish or Hebraic sounding name. And it's being enacted during the carnival season, but the carnival is not a Jewish or Muslim holiday or period, right? This is the celebration right before the Lenten period, and so this is a Catholic celebration. So you have a conflation of odd paradoxical elements all happening at once and happening recurrently for a very, very long time. And what I found is that it's not, again, it's something that's sustained, that's happening all for so many years, reveals a story that's perhaps larger than just a happenstance occurrence. And in fact, we know that as we explore this further, the Jewish community in Mantua, which is a self-sustained community for such a long period of time, in part justified its existence, paid its taxes, justified its right to be in the city by putting on performances. In troubled times, the performances become more expensive, the spectacles become bigger, the effects become grander. This is actually from a different collection, but I thought it was evocative. This is from the Corsini collection, which is in Rome. So in difficult times, in the period of the Counter-Reformation, you've got more lavish performances. In times that are better, it appears in the 1520, 1525 period, it appears that the Jews are able to participate by staging plays in the homes of Christians, because Sir Zoan appears to be a Christian name and not necessarily designated as a Jewish space. So it appears that we have this flexible mechanism of enacting a kind of currency, a kind of cultural currency, which allows people to cohabit, strangely, uneasily sometimes, but through an artistic medium, I would argue. I don't want to idealize this too much, and so I give us an example of another aspect of life for minority members in the Italian peninsula at the time. This is a portion of an altarpiece that's known as the Norsa Madonna. And you see in it an image of a Jewish man from Mantua, whose name is Daniele Norsa, and he was a banker from Mantua. And he's depicted below the Madonna because, this is detailed in a book by Dana Katz, which is a fascinating book about this story. He bought a property on which there was a holy Catholic image. And when he bought the property, he negotiated having it removed, and he paid a certain amount to have it removed so he could live there and feel like he's not living within an image that he doesn't ascribe to. And he paid to have it removed, and he appeared to have all of the assurances that's fine. But after he did that, a new member of the authority came in and said, no, you've done a terrible thing here. You've done a sacrilegious thing. You've erased a Catholic image, and this is sacrilegious. And so he was fined and punished. And part of the punishment was the funding another art piece. So the destruction of one art piece to fund another art piece. And his so-called shame was memorialized forever, one could say, by having his image depicted underneath the Madonna and Child image. But what I wanted to focus on was actually the fact that he has something called the Jewish badge. And we know that minority populations, and this is a tradition that comes from the Muslim world, actually, the minority populations have to be assigned something visually, branded visually, to mark their difference. In the Muslim world, this occurs for Christians and for Jews. And in the context of Mantua and the context of the Italian peninsula, this occurs in this case for Jews who have to wear this Jewish badge. So I want to deepen my story about the importance of theater by also presenting another case from the archives connected to the story of Mantua, in which we have a detail of a permission that was granted to a man known as Simon Basilea, but he's known also in the documents by his stage name of Shlumiel Basilea. And I recently gave a talk to an Iraqi Jewish community in Los Angeles, and the moment I said Shlumiel, everybody burst out laughing because Shlumiel is a kind of stage name. It's like the American term Schlemiel. So it was like a good-for-nothing kind of a guy somebody who can do nothing right. So he was actually known very, very early on. We're talking about the late 1500s. He was known by this name of Shlumiel, which I think is another story altogether. But he was given concession, this actor, this performer, who made his money and made his fame by nothing more than performing in plays and acting different parts. He was given concession not to wear the badge. So you can imagine that's a very important act that the Gonzaga give to very, very select few, but an actor is one of them. And for those of us who study theater and know about what Jonas Barish has called the anti-theatrical prejudice, and we know that all along, for centuries, right, starting with Plato and continuing, there's a bias oftentimes against actors. It's quite astonishing that an actor would be privileged in this way, and he's not the only one from the Jewish troupe of actors from Mantua. And so again, one more reason why performance and theatrical performance is so valued as a cultural currency at this time. Again, not to paint an overly rosy picture, 1612 marks the construction of the Jewish ghetto in Mantua. And this is a little bit different from, of course, the way we think about ghettos in the post-World War II context. In fact, the 1612 construction of the ghetto arguably lies somewhere between, again, we refer to Menno-Kal's notion of the complexity of tolerance, because the ghetto is very close to the ducal palace. So we could argue that, or it has been argued that, in some ways the ghetto was a protective space as well as a segregated space. It's an uneasy argument to make. I'm uneasy with it. And nonetheless, there it is. It's in the most, in a sense, desirable part of town, and in closest within purview of the ducal palace, so that it can be under the protection of the ducal palace. And that's an image of the Mantuan ghetto today, which of course is an open area today. So that's my first story involving Mantua and the Jews of Mantua. And I'd like to turn in my next story to Venice. And we could be facetious and call Venice the large Mantua. And let me borrow from Bronwyn Wilson's lovely book and say that I found very compelling her articulation that, in contrast to the image of civic consensus that was orchestrated by the institutions of the late medieval state and sustained by the repetition of symbolic narratives in ritual and artworks for a local audience, identities in early modern Venice, and we would extend that to northern Italy, were increasingly shaped through exchanges with outsiders, exchanges that were multiplied through the medium of print, and I would extend that to performance too. So you have, again, a pull and tug between standardized views of what culture is about and how culture can be closed or open and controlled. And we have the reality, the living, almost organic reality of migrant communities influencing that culture at the time. And as a hallmark of this, we see the fact that in many of the performance forms that I study, from Commedia dell'arte, the professional theater forms that evolved in Italy in the middle of the 1500s, we've got themes that actually record the presence of minority communities even within the Italian peninsula. This is an opera turchesa, right, a Turkish opera, a Turkish work, not an opera in the sense of singing, and it's called Elisa Ali Bassa, and it somewhat predictably involves love, and it involves miscegenation, right, and it involves conversion as well, because these plays rehearse those tropes quite usually. So it's very much so part of the cultural imagination. So perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that this celebration that maybe is the penultimate, the ultimate celebration in Venice, which is Carnival, also inhabits within it a nod to the Turkish population in Venice at the time. And I'm thinking about the middle of the 1500s. This is an image that's taken from the archives of the Museo Correr. I say that with a smile. It took me 2 years to secure this image because I knew about this image. I'd seen it in a book, and I wanted to get permission for looking and republishing this image. And Jeanette is laughing because we've both, I guess, you know the problem. So you write a letter asking for permission, and it literally took 2 years and me going to Venice for me to actually show you this image here today. So a lot of sweat, but no tears. Venice is no hard work really to visit. But let's take a closer look at this image over here on the bottom right. Right. So we are looking at the bottom right of this image, and you see centrally in the image is the figure sort of suspended. We'll come to that figure in a moment. But at the bottom right of this image, you see a group of 3 people, and if you look closely at their costume, they do appear to be Turkish, right? Because they've got the turbans and they've got dress that doesn't appear to be Venetian particularly, and so they're clearly connected to the performance that's taking place, where this man on an acrobat on a rope is walking across like a tightrope, right? That's suspended above what looks to be both water, right, both the lagoon, and also a portion of St. Mark's Square, a sort of side portion of St. Mark's Square, very close to, on the right, the Ducal Palace, right, the Doge's Palace in the case of the Venetian Republic at the time. And this performance marked the beginning of the carnival season. There's still an echo of this performance, but it's been made a little more politically correct. Now it's called, it used to be called, at the time it was called Il Turco Volante, the Flying Turk. But now it is Il Angelo Volante, the Flying Angel, or Colombina Volante. So the Colombina is actually a character from the Commedia dell'arte. So, but this is the original celebration and ritual. And that's very interesting, I think, for anybody who's cognizant of Ottoman and Venetian relations at the time, because they're a very interesting dance, aren't they, of really collaborative, how would you call it, collaborative enemies in some way, rivals, tremendous rivals, seafaring rivals, trade rivals, who are also exercising a dance, calibrating a dance in a kind of mutual respect at the time. So here you have the celebration, the Catholic celebration of Carnival, marked by the presence of a Muslim Turkish performer or performing troupe. Now, it has been speculated, are they actually Turkish? Are they actually Muslim? Are they pretending or dressed and costumed, and scholars have sort of debated this, either way. Nonetheless, you have the mark of the Turk over here, and then you can sort of play with it. You can riff with it, right? Suspended between sky and oceans, suspended between land and sea, north and south, east and west, the Mediterranean, and other parts of the Mediterranean across it. Dangerously suspended above, right, within our eyesight, but also suspended above, it has been pointed out, the place where if you just went down into the piazza, that's where the place where criminals were brought before the public to be seen and judged before they get sentenced. So a kind of incriminated space at the same time is also a place of privilege because everybody's watching the performer, the daredevil performer. Okay, I think I have an image, a close-up of the performer, and it's sort of interesting to speculate because he looks like he's dressed less in the Turk. He doesn't seem to have the Turkish turban. It's a little bit murky. It's difficult to see, but there you go. All right, I'm on to my third and final story, and I'm still staying in Venice, but now I'm going to turn to the Jewish community in Venice. And interestingly, the Jewish Venetian ghetto is the first of its kind, right? We have the name ghetto actually from Venice, and it meant foundry because the ghetto is actually established in the island where you had the foundry, and it was a little bit separated because in case of fire, it needed to be a place that could be localized and shut down very quickly. And so there's a water that surrounds the ghetto area, and you could sort of see that. It's the section marked the new ghetto Nuovo, and you could see it surrounded by water. And in fact, the Jewish community had to pay for 4 Christian gatekeepers, right, to surround and keep them tucked in, so to speak. It's interesting that the proclamation is made in 1516. I share this with you because the proclamation was made in this particular room where I'm shown. This was taken a year ago to mark the 500th year anniversary or mark of the establishment of the first ghetto in the world, of the Venetian ghetto. And the proclamation was made in this very, very room that you see here. So sort of historically chilling, isn't it, to think about that. And the way it resonated through time. The interesting thing about the Venetian ghetto to remember is that, yes, it did mean that the population of Jews is closed in, but they're closed in for only a certain part of the day, not for 24 hours. With the sounding of the marangona, right, which is the bell that rings in the morning signaling the start of the working day, the Venetian ghetto has to be opened. With the 14th hour, as it was called at the time, which is sunset, the Venetian ghetto has to be closed. But for the period between sun up and sundown, there's complete freedom to go in and out of the ghetto for Christian Muslim inhabitants to go in, for Jewish inhabitants to go out. So even though we think of it as a secluded, segregated space, and it was only so for a certain portion of the day, which again is this strange complexity. Intolerance/intolerance at the time. Yeah. Okay. I'm sharing the fact that beginning in 1531, we start to see, beginning earlier for musicians and for dancers, but then in 1531 for theater performers, we know that there is a tremendous amount of borrowing of performers. And this is sort of important to note because for a time, scholars of theater kind of affirmed and reaffirmed the fact that there's complete separation between the audiences for the enactments of performances. And we find when we go into the archives that is absolutely not the case. And it's a complete misunderstanding of what's going on. So we know that there, in fact, is a tremendous amount of collaboration and tremendous amount of audiences that are borrowing. And in fact, we even know that there is, towards the later period, an impresario. This is the second to last line there, whose name was Yosef Kamis, which is a Hebrew name, known as a doctor and philosopher, and he was a kind of impresario of the new and emerging opera at the time. So we know that from the Christian end, there's a tremendous amount of collaboration and influence that the Jewish world has in terms of interacting. We also know see this image? I mean, if you look at this image, it looks, to me as a commedia dell'arte scholar, I would say, yes, absolutely, that's a commedia dell'arte troupe, right? There's a kind of Arlecchino, Harlequin character on the far right? He has the mask, he has the slapstick, which is absolutely identifiable as Arlecchino. The third figure from the left looks like a kind of Pantalone, old man, Venetian man figure, like the Shylock, maybe of Merchant of Venice type. On the left, the half mask is clearly connected with Carnival or clearly connected with Commedia dell'arte. And of course, in the middle, you've got this sort of pagan-looking musician performers. But what's shocking about this image is it doesn't actually occur in a Christian or Catholic text. It is, in fact, part of a series of images, of engravings that are connected to a book that's called Sefer HaMinhagim, the Book of Rituals, which is a book, strangely, published in Venice in the late 16th century and published in Yiddish, which is, a dialect, a Jewish dialect at the time, which we associate with a later period in a different part of Europe, but nonetheless, there it is. And so this is connected to the Jewish holiday of Purim, which runs roughly sidelong the carnival period, but of course within the Jewish religious context. And it's very surprising to find this kind of image as a signal image identifying that ritual and that holiday. So clearly influences are going in both ways, and we have sort of cross currents at the time. And this so-called, I could have added a fourth story, which would have been how does the performance tradition end? Because we often talk about how things begin, but sometimes we don't pay as much attention to how things end. And the Mantuan tradition of Jewish performance ends from an interesting reason. It starts to end, you could say, in 1630, because 1628 to 1631 is a very uneasy period in the Mantuan history, because it's the period of the wars of Mantuan succession, period where the Gonzaga, who'd ruled so successfully for such a long time, couldn't get it together to create an heir. Basically, they had the old European problem, and so there was a kind of a war of succession, which led to an incursion of outside forces and the forced expulsion, actually, of the Jewish population in 1630. But only for a year. They were brought back in 1631, at which point immediately the performances resumed. So we would expect 1630 to be the end of the performances. That actually wasn't the situation. 1650 was the end of the performance, and it came from, again, an unexpected source. It came from within the Jewish community itself. Voices within the community started to oppose the performance. Again, it's a currency. It's a cultural currency. If it's a cultural currency, it runs two ways. It takes two to tango. And if one of the participant members doesn't want to anymore, and internal forces that became more conservative within the Jewish community started to say, no more, we have problems with it. And they did it for a couple of reasons, one of which was influential voices, such as the voice of this one rabbi, actually working mostly in Venice. His name is Shmuel Abuab, and he writes a text that's part of the responsa literature, this huge body of literature where people ask questions of their clergy, and the clergy respond, and it's called responsa literature in Judaic studies. And he writes in his book Dvar Shmuel. Dvar Shmuel means the sayings of Shmuel. He writes that he opposes theater and the construction of theaters, because he's talking about people who build these theaters. They build theaters and circuses where men and women, children come together. Modest and chaste Jewish daughters sit together with profligate women of the streets, prostitutes. And all, great and small, violate the laws of Moses, and I skip down. They lead them into temptation. They lead little children into temptation, the actors, by having them sit with actors and listen to their obscene talk, which poisons their young souls. Again, we see this as the anti-theatrical prejudice reaching cross-culturally here. But so it's these type of internal forces, it's this type of a voice within actually the Jewish community that leads, again, somewhat paradoxically, in the complex story of this continued ritual. And I'll just end by showing you the inside, the internal space of speaking about spaces of the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue that still stands today in Mantua, as testament to that vibrant community's past. I thank you.
3:05, you have 20 minutes to the coffee break, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
You've indicated that the Jewish community was welcomed once Ferdinand and Isabella threw them out of Spain into Italy because they were lenders of money. But was it also true that the Jewish arts community was vibrant and they also welcomed because of their talents in the theater?
Well, it's a great question, right? Because one of the big questions that lie behind this tremendous tradition of theater making is, okay, so why? What made the Jewish theater different from other theater, and why did they capitalize on it? And it's always known as, and it's very important to say again, within the complexity of this, they're never referred to as the actors. They're always the Ebrei, the Jews. So the category of being a Jewish actor, of being a Jewish performer, was what made them different. And so the question really is, we don't know exactly. My speculation is, it's totally a speculation, although somewhat founded, is that first of all, you have tremendously creative voices. You have this Shmuel Basilea. You have also, I didn't even mention by name, the most important theater maker in Mantua at the time is a man named Leone de Solmi. Leone de Solmi. Solmi means the summits. So Leone at the summits. He's so good as a theater maker that he reaches Mount Everest of creative artists in a sense. Leone de Solmi works at the time, works throughout the 1500s, and he writes plays. He writes plays in Italian. He writes plays in Hebrew. He also stages plays. He writes a discourse about the art of staging things. So clearly, you've got some brilliant creators within this population. And my other speculation here has to do with the notion of flexibility that I referred to in cost and in extravagance that you can produce. These plays and these performances were often staged, yes, for carnival, but also for the weddings, for the celebrations, for the arrival of diplomats from across Europe. And so whoever was able to produce them in a magnificent, marvelous, wonderful way, would help to create credibility for the ruling Gonzaga as well. And one of the things that we know from some of the archival sources is that, at least in two cases that I saw, the Jewish performances are connected to an interesting word in Italian, and that's vaghezze. Vaghezze. Vaghezze, to an English speaker, you think, oh, vagaries? No. Vaghezze means effects. And vaghezze in the early modern context is vaghezze, emotional effects. How something is able to emotionally affect you when you're watching it. So something about sound, fire effects, lighting effects, whatever it might be, that can arouse your passion as an audience member is very much so appreciated. And the Jewish spectacles are at least in the two cases that I saw, are the ones that are connected to that expression of vaghezze, which might indicate that in terms of scenic design or effects or materials, they were able to, maybe because of a bit more mobility outside also of Mantua, maybe they were able to bring in some better effects than the other performances were able to. Also, it was convenient. You have a population that is willingly kind of trying to curry favor with the Dukes because of performance. So I know from the internal Jewish sources that they sometimes go to great lengths to collect internally taxes from the population to pay for these things. So you've got a kind of self-funding mechanism. So you can see there's a convenience element. But it's a great question, and one that in research I'm always thinking about. Yes, Jeanette.
I must say, thank you very much. This is so exciting, and I've always been intrigued by the idea of the flying of the Turco Volante, because it's very. There are different aspects to it. One is it's a great metaphor because there's this guy doing this tightrope walk. He's not flying in a highly official space, the Piazza San Marco, which is designed as if it was a proscenium, as if it was a stage. It is a stage in many ways. So you have a city that is a stage, and on which is really a very multivalent idea. And I was wondering, in terms of spaces, if you could share a little more out of your wealth of knowledge as to how spaces were regulated. You mentioned the ghettos. But was there free walkability, or is there more of this space economy?
I think it's a great point, and you articulated it so beautifully. This image of somebody flying, defying, right, what we know to be possible, and it being the very person, figure that you're most afraid of, in a sense. So you're almost aggrandizing their power at the same time as you're watching with terror, and you know that it's a kind of a device, it's a fraud because it's on a tightrope, nonetheless. So yes, and I should also say that once he reaches across from the water, he then acrobatically makes his way down through the pillars, and then he's supposed to land at the feet of the Doge, at the feet of the Duke, and kiss his feet, and then proclaim all kinds of poetry and do a kind of performance, which is also interesting and lovely, and symbolic, very symbolic. And in the same place, and I think it's also interesting because in the same place, any small, you absolutely rightly identify that the Venetian power absolutely by this point had waned completely compared to the Turkish power. There's no question. And so any little peep of a success, immediately published all of these canzoni, all these books of song and praise to laud the successes, because clearly they're desperate for any shard of sort of preserving dignity at this point. And so absolutely, this is a theatrical arena completely. The ghetto itself, which is highly tightly regulated, again, after the performances take place usually late afternoon into the evening. So technically speaking, you shouldn't be there. You're there because the doors are supposed to, things are supposed to close at a certain point. And especially in the winter months, that becomes more problematic as things get darker earlier. Nonetheless, we know that there are people going out and people going in quite often, because we know that people have to pay fines because they've done it. So, and we can see the counter evidence that way. But the ghetto space is itself also a theatrical space. We know that in the 17th century, we know that there's a very famous Jewish salon that happens in the Venetian ghetto. And there's a woman who runs that, a Jewish woman who runs that salon, Sarah Shalem, who's also from Sulam, the name, so she's from a Turkish, by way of Spain, so back 2 centuries earlier, families from Spain, exiled from Spain. And here she is, she's running this kind of cultural center of learning and poetry and the exchange of ideas and art at the time. But from the confined space of her actual internal space of her house within which is small. In the Mantua instance, I was very lucky to be in Mantua studying where the very well-appreciated musicologist Anne McNeil was there, and she said to me, Erith, if you ever figure out which rooms the Jews performed in, tell me, because everybody's desperate to figure it out. We don't exactly know where. We know that in some occasions for the dukes, they performed within the ducal palace. Very interestingly, we have one case, the two big dukes, Gonzaga dukes who sponsored the Jewish performers was first William Gonzaga, and then Vincenzo Gonzaga. And Vincenzo Gonzaga famously visits the synagogue space, in which he sees a kind of small performance, which is very interesting. In one case, and we also have the receipts for the sweets that he was served on that visit, so we know he also ate. But that's definitely something to think about a little bit more. Within the activities of commedia dell'arte, the professional theater, it's always outside. It's in the piazza oftentimes, not always I should say, but oftentimes in the piazza. Within these tributes that are done, civic tributes, they're always outside. So to what extent did the Jews participate in that, outside or inside? The evidence that I find always is connected to a space, an internal space. But that's a really, really important line of inquiry. So let me get back to you in a year or two. Yes.
Thank you very much. That was really eye-opening. And I just wondered, before the closure of the ghetto, were there, what kinds of daily interactions were there? I know in the descriptions you mentioned briefly, descriptions of Cairo and Istanbul and various cities up till the beginning of the 20th century, especially
the Venetian ghetto is erected 1516, and the Mantuan ghetto is erected almost 100 years later. It's a really different kind of place. So in Mantua you have a tremendous amount of exposure and unlimited exposure, you could say, right, amongst the communities. In Venice, that's true until the regulation of the ghetto, except that even with the regulation of the ghetto, as I showed, during the day, anybody can be anywhere, and you're completely unregulated. So I think there's a lot of exposure and a lot of connection and a lot of contact. And I think you're right to think about, Levantine cities, about other parts of the Mediterranean and the Muslim world, where of course that we know that to be true. And I know that Fariba is finishing her book on a part of Istanbul, which really was a haven and a place of great commingling of Armenian, Jewish, Muslim, Christian population. So there's much to be said about that. With regards to the holy space, yes, he uses the term kuf in Hebrew, keilat l'shah. No question, that's holy space, and it's used again and again. Keilat l'shah, and it's really hard hitting. It's no joke. And yes, they considered now that the ghetto space becomes this protected. It's very strange and paradoxical. Again, it's almost like embracing the closure. It's the same strangeness that we have with the ducal protection, and thinking about the ghetto as a protected space as well. But the community grows increasingly insular in the 17th century, and you could also see that as symptomatic of the Baroque, right? As the Catholic Baroque is really taking full steam, and you have almost a kind of a propaganda machine working in both ways, right? And you have reasons why the community wants to be a little more secluded. In Mantua, we can't underestimate the trauma of the War of Mantuan Succession. 1628 to 1631 are really difficult. Yes.
Could you help us speak to the microphone?
Yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, okay. Yes. So maybe I'll take the next question mic'd. So sorry about that. Yes. For no.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk, and of course there are lots of parallels between Venice and Istanbul. Those cities look really alike, and they're really in contact. But I'm actually writing about this. What happens when the Ottomans conquer Cyprus in 1571? There's an expulsion of the Turks from Venice as well as Jews. All right. So in 1571, it seems like there's a turning point, the end of that kind of tolerance in Venice, as far as Ottoman Jews are concerned. Because what happens when the Jews end up in Istanbul, they become the Mantova. So they use Ottoman protection to go back to Italy to trade. So they have this legal protection of the Ottomans. But even those people get expelled in 1571. And I wonder whether they come back, because I think these festivals, yes, you're absolutely right, they're an outlet, right, to kind of make fun of, mock the Turk or the Ottoman. You have the same ones in Istanbul, but the Turks are mocking the Persians. So I think there are these turning points where there's less tolerance. And Venice, it's 1571 century when there's this expulsion and absence of Muslims in Europe, because it continues, and then you have the expulsion from Spain in 1604, the final expulsion, and they don't go back. Right? So to me, it sounds like what's happening to the Jews is similar to what's happening to the Muslims, and then they're kind of forced to take up some in order to survive.
I think that's really interesting. I think it's interesting to trace where the populations migrate to, where the creative populations migrate to, because we know that when I can speak to the case of the Jews of Venice and Mantua. We know that when the 1630 expulsion occurs from Mantua, who wins most is Venice, because all those artists go to Venice. And it was actually a terrible tragedy, because there was a fire in Venice and a lot of them were killed. But that was just horrible luck. But otherwise, there they were in Venice. And so I think there's also a story about networks, traveling networks, nomadic networks amongst the creative communities. I mean, we know this amongst the visual artists, right? We know this amongst the performing artists in the Christian or secular context, because they they make their fame and they make money by going from patron to patron, basically, at this time. So why wouldn't it be true of these minority communities? With regard to the Turkish performers, the Flying Turk is not the only instance of Turkish performers. The Turks are oftentimes, and Fariba and I were talking about this at lunch, they are oftentimes identified as people who do daredevil feats. Dangerous feats, acrobatic feats, and of course that is a tradition that begins already in the Ottoman world. I mean, so they're gaining those abilities, those professional abilities in the Ottoman world, and they're bringing them into the European world. So I know of an instance in which there's a delegation from Mantua that goes to Prague, and the Mantuan delegation of diplomats and Gonzaga emissaries, high, important people, takes with them the Jews, and they take with them Turkish acrobatic performers.
So that's
Migration, and creative migration, and the creative circulation of ideas. And then you can only imagine then what happens in Prague. Who sees that in Prague, and where does it go from Prague? Because it's contagious, right? Thank you so much for these questions. There were anything more? One more? No. Thank you. I appreciate that.